What if the woman you mocked today once saved your life? Take a moment and look around your world. That man sleeping under the bridge, that woman talking to herself outside the grocery store. Do you ever wonder who they once were? What they gave up before the world gave up on them? Before we go further, let me ask you something that matters more than anything. How are you feeling today? How's your family holding up? I ask. Because stories like this, stories we don't talk about enough, remind us just how fragile dignity really is and how quickly heroes can become invisible. This is the story of Loretta James, a black woman in her 50s, scarred inside and out. She fought in the Gulf War. She wore a soldier's uniform, earned a Silver Star, and dragged men twice her size out of fire and rubble. But 30 years later, society sees only a tattered coat, cracked shoes, and gray hair. She was arrested at a mall for disturbing the peace, laughed at, shoved, dragged to court in chains. No one knew she had saved a man once. No one knew that man had become Judge Maurice Denton, the same man who now sat high on the bench, and sentenced her. Rain came down in gray streaks that Thursday afternoon, tapping gently on the roof of Hamilton Crossings Mall. The automatic doors sighed open and shut, ushering in warm air and hurried footsteps. Shoppers clutched their bags and passed the security desk without a second glance. No one noticed the woman standing off to the side just beyond the reach of the heater vent. Loretta James stood like she always did, back straight, shoulders squared as though she were still on patrol. But time had etched itself across her face and body. Her coat army green was torn at the sleeve and stained along the hem. Her shoes, combat boots from a war long over, were cracked and too thin for the cold. Her gray hair peeked from under a knit cap, one that had once been red but was now faded with time and silence. She didn't beg, she never had. Instead, she watched people, patterns, movement, security routes. It was automatic for her residual instincts from the battlefield. Children tugged at their parents' hands. Teens laughed too loudly. One of them looked at her and made a face, a mocking little smirk as he passed. She said nothing. She hadn't spoken aloud in hours. A small cup of coffee, lukewarm, now trembled in her hand. She had used her last $1.25 to buy it. The girl at the register hadn't met her eyes, just slid the cup forward and looked away. Loretta had served 18 months in the Gulf. The searing desert winds of 1991 still echoed in her dreams. She could remember the names of the injured, she treated the tourniquets, she tied the prayers, she whispered over shattered bodies. But none of that mattered now. What people saw today was not a soldier, not a veteran, not even a woman with a name. They saw a nuisance. Security guards at the mall had begun circling. Loretta felt them long before they spoke. A sixth sense. One stepped closer, a young man, maybe in his 20s, with a half smile that didn't reach his eyes. The kind of man who saw only what he was told to see. "Ma'am, I'm gonna need you to leave the premises," he said, gesturing toward the door. "I ain't done nothing," she replied quietly, not looking at him. He scoffed. "You've been loitering, scaring customers. We've had complaints." Loretta's lips tightened. Her knee ached where the metal still lived under the skin. Her back felt like it was splitting in two. But she didn't move. She had stood in worse places than this. Desert outposts, field hospitals, mortar zones. The second guard came up behind her now, bigger, less patient. "You deaf or something," he said. When the first one reached out to grab her arm, Loretta flinched. Instinct. She yanked back and suddenly the coffee spilled. A few customers screamed, someone recorded it on their phone, and within seconds, Loretta James, once a decorated soldier, was slammed to the cold tile floor. Her arms twisted behind her back and dragged out the front door in full view of the Saturday crowd. Her coat tore wider at the sleeve. Her head hit the curb, and no one asked her name. The station-holding cell smelled like bleach and cold steel. Loretta sat on the bench in silence, eyes forward, her fingers tracing the scar that ran down her forearm, a souvenir from shrapnel in '91. A thin Latina officer walked past, pausing briefly. "You okay, ma'am?" she asked, a flicker of concern in her voice. Loretta nodded, though her hands trembled. The officer glanced down at the report in her hand. Disturbing the peace. Resisted removal from mall property, no weapons, no drugs, no priors. She looked up. "You served." Loretta didn't respond. But the officer noticed the faded tattoo just above Loretta's collarbone, an eagle perched on a flag. The symbol of the 18th Airborne Corps. "I thought so," she whispered. But protocol moved faster than memory. Within hours, Loretta had a court date scheduled for Monday morning. No legal aid had been assigned yet. No phone call was offered. Her name became a file number. Her history was not requested. The city courthouse was 2 blocks from the shelter where she sometimes found a bed. A place where veterans laid side by side, broken by time, unseen by the world they once protected. Monday arrived like a slap. Cloudy skies, damp wind. Loretta walked to the courthouse in the same coat, her breath fogging in the air. Courtroom 2B was a sterile place, bright lights, wooden benches, flags pinned to the wall like afterthoughts. Loretta stood before the bench, her posture defiant, though her legs shook from exhaustion. She didn't recognize the man in the robe. Judge Maurice Denton. White, late 40s, clean-shaven. He didn't look down when she walked in. He read from the case file as if she were already guilty. "The court calls the case of Loretta James," the bailiff said, "charged with disorderly conduct and obstruction." The prosecutor, a smug young man in a designer suit, smirked. "Your Honor, the defendant has shown a pattern of behavior disruptive to public spaces. She is uncooperative and prone to conflict. We ask for the maximum fine and supervised probation." Loretta tried to speak. "I didn't do nothing." "You'll speak when spoken to," the judge snapped, not looking up. She closed her mouth. Her eyes dropped. Her torn coat rustled softly as she adjusted her stance. In the corner, seated among the court staff, was Noah Alvarez, a deputy warden in training. 28 second-generation Mexican-American working the courthouse rotation as part of his certification. He'd read the docket that morning out of habit. When he saw the name Loretta James, something tugged at him. His grandfather had fought in Desert Storm. Once long ago, he'd told Noah about a black woman medic who saved his unit's commanding officer during a surprise artillery barrage. He didn't know her name, but he remembered the story. "She ran through fire," Grandpa had said, pulled a man from under a collapsed bunker, wrapped his chest with her own shirt to stop the bleeding. Noah watched Loretta, now silent, alone, humiliated, and felt something in his gut shift. He would ask his grandfather tonight, but something already told him. This was her. The courtroom emptied slowly after the hearing. People filtered out like they always did, murmuring, glancing, then forgetting. Just another case, just another name. But Loretta sat stiff on the bench beside the public defender's table, her hands folded in her lap like she was back in formation waiting for orders. Judge Denton didn't look at her again. She was assigned a court date in 2 weeks, handed a small paper with no envelope, and told she could leave. She didn't ask questions. She simply stood and walked out, her coat still damp, her boots squeaking faintly on the polished floor. Noah Alvarez lingered near the clerk's desk. Something about the way she stood had gripped him, her stillness, her pain worn like armor. But it wasn't just her presence, it was the name. The story from his grandfather kept looping in his head. Noah waited until his shift ended, then drove straight to the assisted living home in Southgate where his grandfather, Carlos Alvarez, stayed. Carlos was 85 now, slow-moving and half-blind, but the stories hadn't left him. He could still recite troop movements from 30 years ago with military precision. Grandpa Noah said, pulling out a chair beside him, "Do you remember the name of that black medic you told me about? The one who saved that commanding officer?" Carlos nodded slowly. "Not her name. But I remember what she looked like. Short, solid, tough, big scar across her arm. She never talked much. Only time I saw her cry was when she thought we were all going to die under that shelter." "Do you remember the officer she saved?" Carlos squinted. "Yeah, white guy, Lieutenant Maurice Denton." Noah leaned back in his chair. His stomach dropped. "Judge Maurice Denton." Carlos blinked, then gave a small laugh. "Well, I'll be damned." "Yeah. Denton. He was pinned under concrete. She pulled him out while the sky was falling. We thought he was gone. Never saw her again after that day." Noah stood up, heart pounding. "Thanks, Grandpa." Back in his car, Noah didn't hesitate. He started digging. A few calls, a few quiet favors. He reached out to a Veterans Archive coordinator he'd worked with during a prior case, and within hours, a scanned document appeared in his inbox. Silver Star citation, awarded to Specialist Loretta M. James for gallantry in action during Operation Desert Storm. It detailed the rescue, the injuries, the blood loss, the chaos, and the name of the soldier she saved, Lieutenant Maurice Denton. Noah stared at the screen, his jaw clenched. The woman sentenced today for disturbing the peace had once been a battlefield angel crawling through fire to save a man who now wore a judge's robe. This wasn't just injustice. This was betrayal. The next morning, Judge Denton sat in his chambers reviewing schedules and sipping his usual black coffee. His face was unreadable, lined not by age, but by years of seeing everything and saying little. A knock at the door. "Come in." Noah stepped in, holding a folder. Judge Denton, I have something you need to see. Denton glanced up annoyed. Can this wait? No, sir, it really can't. Denton set down his mug. Proceed. Noah placed the file on the desk and opened it. Inside was the Silver Star citation and a faded photograph. In the image, a young black woman, mud-streaked eyes fierce, crouched beside a stretcher, her uniform torn, bloodied. A man with a bandaged torso lay unconscious on the cot behind her. Denton froze. He reached for the file with slow hands, flipping the page, then another, and another. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse. Where did you get this? That woman you sentenced yesterday. That's Loretta James, the woman who saved you in 1991. Denton looked like he'd been slapped. He leaned back, eyes unfocused. I didn't even recognize her, he whispered. Noah waited, his hands clenched at his sides. She was covered in blood when they found us, Denton said finally. My lungs were collapsed. I was dying. She carried me back 2 miles through enemy fire. He closed the folder gently. And I just sentenced her for disturbing the damn peace. The room fell silent. Then Denton stood up. Get me her case file. All of it. Call the clerk. This is going to be corrected. Meanwhile, Loretta walked back toward the shelter. Her steps were slow, her breath heavy. She passed the same alley, the same diner where no one ever looked her in the eye. The cup of soup she had for lunch sat heavy in her gut, but it was the only hot thing she'd eaten all day. She didn't know anything had changed. She had been forgotten for so long it never crossed her mind that someone might remember. By Wednesday, a stir began to form around the courthouse. Clerks whispered. A veteran affairs coordinator had been called into chambers. An emergency motion was filed, and Loretta James was requested to return for an immediate hearing. When she arrived, her expression didn't change. She assumed it was bad news, a technicality, another fine she couldn't pay. But this time the courtroom wasn't half empty. People were seated. Press had shown up. A few veterans in uniform stood in the back row. Noah was there, seated to the side, watching. Denton entered the courtroom in silence. When he sat down, he didn't open a file. He looked directly at Loretta. Miss James, he began, his voice calm but shaking slightly. Please step forward. She approached, guarded, tired. Denton stood up. I made a grave error earlier this week. An error not just of law, but of memory, of respect. The room held its breath. I convicted you without understanding who you were and what you had already given this country. In 1991, you saved my life on the battlefield in Iraq. I was a young lieutenant. I was dying. Loretta blinked, her mouth slightly open. Denton continued. You didn't hesitate. You ran into hell to pull me out, and I did not even recognize the face of my own salvation. He turned to the courtroom. I hereby vacate all charges against Miss Loretta James. This court will formally submit a request to the Department of Defense to recognize her service, restore her benefits, and honor her publicly. He removed his robe, slowly folded it, and walked down from the bench. And then, before the entire court, he knelt. I sentenced a hero without realizing that I owe her my life. Loretta stood still. Her hands trembled. The silence in the courtroom was deep reverent. And then someone began to clap. Then another. Then everyone. Veterans stood and saluted. Reporters stood stunned, and Loretta, she lowered her head, eyes filling, and whispered something no one quite heard. The air outside the courthouse that day was crisp, but Loretta James barely felt it. She stood at the top of the steps, blinking against the sunlight, as cameras clicked and reporters pushed forward with microphones. For the first time in decades, people were looking at her, but not through her, not past her, at her. It was overwhelming. Miss James, how does it feel to be recognized after all these years, one reporter asked. What do you want the public to know about your story? Asked another. Loretta didn't answer at first. The world had spent so long ignoring her voice, it felt strange to be asked to speak. She stared out over the crowd. Veterans in dress blues, strangers holding signs, students from the nearby university who had walked over just to watch. I don't need glory, she said finally, voice steady. I just need someone to remember that I stood. There was no applause, just a deep collective silence, respect. And then quietly the crowd began to part as an elderly man stepped forward. He was in a wheelchair flanked by 2 VA nurses. His hair was silver, his skin creased with age, but the moment Loretta saw his face, she knew. Sergeant Miller, she said, eyes widening. He gave a slow smile. I thought you were a ghost. He had served with her in the 305th Medical Battalion. They hadn't seen each other since the ceasefire. Word had spread quickly among old veterans when the story broke. Some were already reaching out. A few had flown in just to see her walk free. Loretta knelt beside his chair and took his hand. I thought you were dead, she whispered. So did I, he chuckled. Until I saw you on the news. You look different, but your eyes, same damn fighter. Over the next few days, everything changed. A formal motion was filed with the Department of Veterans Affairs to restore Loretta's benefits. Her military records were pulled. Her Silver Star citation was verified. The city arranged temporary housing and medical care while her status was sorted. Donations poured in from around the country, veterans, school teachers, even children who wrote notes saying thank you. Noah Alvarez was by her side for much of it, quietly handling logistics. He didn't speak for her, he didn't need to, but he made sure her paperwork moved, that every missed call was returned, and that when the press started hounding her, she had someone to filter the noise. "I didn't do much," he said one afternoon. "You remembered," she replied. That night, Loretta returned to the shelter one last time, not to sleep but to say goodbye. The hall was quiet. The other residents didn't know quite what to say. Some nodded. A few offered a handshake. One older woman embraced her with tears in her eyes. "You give us hope," she said. Loretta didn't know what to do with that. She had never considered herself a symbol. She just wanted warmth, dignity, a bed. But now she was more than the forgotten woman at the mall. She was living proof that the system could be wrong and that sometimes, if rarely, it could be made right again. A week later, the mayor's office organized an official recognition ceremony. It was held at City Hall, but the hall couldn't hold the crowd that showed up. Veterans from across the state filled the courtyard. Former soldiers from Loretta's unit arrived in uniform, some walking with canes, others proudly holding photos of their younger selves. The honor guard lined the steps. The city band played the national anthem. The mayor took the podium. "We failed, Miss James," she said plainly. "We failed to recognize her sacrifice, and in doing so, we dishonored every soldier who's come home to nothing. Today, we begin to correct that mistake." She turned to Loretta, who stood nearby, now wearing a fresh uniform tailored for the event, her silver star pinned to her chest, hair pulled back, shoulders still strong. Loretta James, the mayor, continued, "You represent the best of this nation, not just because you served, but because you endured, because you held on to your humanity even when no one gave it back to you. For your courage under fire and for the quiet strength that followed, we thank you." The crowd stood and clapped. But this time it wasn't applause for spectacle, it was reverence. Then Judge Maurice Denton stepped forward. There was tension in the air. Some veterans still hadn't forgiven him for what happened, but he didn't hide from it. "I was saved once on a battlefield," he said, "and then I turned around and condemned the very person who saved me. There is no excuse for that. But there is accountability." He turned to Loretta. "I owe you a debt I can never repay. But today I give you what should have been given long ago, your name, your honor, your place in history." He stepped aside as a wall-sized bronze panel was unveiled, etched with names of distinguished veterans from the state, and their newly added was hers. Specialist Loretta M. James, 305th Medical Battalion Gulf War, Silver Star recipient. The applause was thunderous. Students stood with their hands over their hearts. Veterans saluted, some wept. Loretta stepped up to the microphone. "I didn't come here for recognition," she began. "And I didn't carry that man through sand and blood because I thought I'd be famous for it. I did it because it was the right thing to do." She paused. "I lost years. I lost my home, my health. I lost the respect I had for a country that promised it wouldn't leave soldiers behind. But even when I was invisible, I never stopped standing." She looked out at the sea of faces. "And I'll keep standing. For those still in the shelters, still walking the streets, still wearing the uniform inside their skin, even when nobody sees it, remember them, see them." She stepped back, voice clear, eyes shining. The moment wasn't just for her. It was for all of them. The news cycle had shifted. What began as a small case in a quiet courtroom had become a national story. Veteran publications ran Loretta's photo on their covers. Local news anchors used phrases like "the forgotten hero" and "a lesson in humility." Military groups reached out from all over the country. Members of Congress even issued public statements, and a veterans' rights bill that had long sat dormant was suddenly being re-examined. Loretta James had become a symbol. But symbols don't sleep better at night. They don't heal decades of neglect overnight. And for Loretta, being remembered still came with pain. After the ceremony at City Hall, she was offered temporary housing in a nearby apartment complex for senior veterans. It was warm, clean, and furnished. She had her own room, her own key. She even received a call from the Department of Veterans Affairs with a caseworker assigned to expedite her benefits. Still, Loretta sat on the edge of her new bed that night, staring out the window. The city lights shimmered below, and she held a small photo in her hand, her unit from 1991. Some of those faces were long gone, buried or lost to time. Others, She had no idea where they ended up. The war hadn't ended for any of them. It had simply faded from the headlines. A knock came at the door. Noah Alvarez stepped inside holding 2 paper bags. "Thought you might be hungry," he said. "Chicken and rice, and peach cobbler." Loretta raised an eyebrow. "You didn't make that." "Nope," he laughed. "My mama did. I'm not even allowed in her kitchen." She cracked the faintest smile and took the bag. As they ate, Noah asked, "How are you really feeling?" Loretta shrugged, "Like I woke up in someone else's life." He nodded slowly. "I imagine it's hard to trust it." She looked out the window again. "I waited years for someone to say my name right. Years. And now they're putting it on plaques. I'm grateful, but I didn't want fame. I just wanted not to be erased." Noah sat with her in silence. He didn't try to fix it. He understood now. Some wounds don't close. Some you carry. But then the phone rang. Loretta picked it up slowly. "This is James." Ms. James said, the voice on the other end calm, formal. "This is Colonel Erica Bryant. I oversee the National Veterans Memorial Commission. We've been following your story." Loretta blinked. "Yes, ma'am. We would like to formally induct your name onto the Wall of Honor in Washington, D.C. Your citation will be read during the Memorial Day Remembrance Ceremony. It's a national broadcast. Would you be willing to attend and speak?" Loretta was silent. She looked at Noah. He nodded. She returned to the call. Yes, I'd be honored." The months passed quickly. Loretta's story remained in public memory. Students wrote essays about her. Veterans began holding Loretta Day events at community centers. She was invited to speak at high schools, universities, and even a West Point seminar on women in combat. Each time she told the same truth. You don't have to carry a weapon to fight. You don't have to win medals to be brave. But if you stand for what's right, even when no one salutes you, then you've served something bigger than yourself. The climax of this chapter came on Memorial Day. The Washington air was heavy with early summer heat. The lawn around the National Mall was crowded with thousands of families, soldiers and uniformed students, waving flags, older men wearing their service caps and campaign ribbons. A stage had been built facing the Wall of Honor. Dignitaries spoke, bands played, wreaths were laid. Then her name was called. "Please welcome Silver Star recipient specialist Loretta James." Loretta rose from her seat and walked forward, her knees still stiff, but her back as straight as ever. The applause wasn't thunderous, it wasn't frenzied. It was respectful. Quiet. Enduring. She stood at the podium and looked out over the field of faces. "You know," she began, "I used to think silence was safer. That it was easier to fade than to fight for your place in a world that's already moved on." She looked down at her citation. "But there's a cost to silence. It chips away at who you are. Every day you don't say your name, it's like forgetting you ever had one." She paused. "I'm here today, not because I was strong, but because someone finally remembered. A young man I never met looked past my coat, my hair, my pain, and saw a soldier. And then a judge remembered the face I wore when I saved his life. And then you, all of you, chose to listen." She pointed gently toward the wall where her name had just been etched in bronze. "My name's up there now, but there are others who should be. People who died forgotten, people who never got to walk free again." She closed her eyes for a moment. In her mind, she saw the desert, the bunker, the blood, the sounds. When she opened them, they were steady. Don't wait 30 years to see someone. See them now. Hear them now. She stepped away from the microphone. The entire crowd stood, saluted, held a moment of silence that felt like thunder. Judge Denton was in the front row, eyes filled with tears. He didn't approach her. He didn't need to. The honor wasn't his to claim anymore. It was hers. A month after Memorial Day, Loretta James sat at a wide oak desk in a sunlit room that didn't smell like bleach or rust. The walls were decorated with framed newspaper articles, photos of her unit, and the folded American flag that once draped her friend's casket. The room was hers, a private study inside a newly established Veterans Outreach Center on the west side of the city. The name engraved on the building's glass entrance. The Loretta M. James Center for Forgotten Veterans. It had been Judge Denton's idea. After the ceremony in D.C., he'd stepped back from the bench. Not in disgrace, but in reflection. He began quietly working with veterans groups, lobbying city officials, and donating a chunk of his family estate to fund a center where no soldier would ever be ignored again. He never made a public statement about it, never took credit. He just made sure the building got built, and that Loretta was the one to cut the ribbon. Noah Alvarez had taken a position at the center as program director. He worked closely with Loretta, helping design veteran re-entry programs, mental health services, and job training initiatives. Every morning she walked into that building like it was a post on duty, not because she had to, but because she chose to. The people who came in didn't always recognize her at first. Some were young, fresh out of Afghanistan or Syria. Others were older like her, worn by decades of fighting a country that had promised not to forget them. One man, Marcus, a Navy vet who'd been living out of his car, broke down crying when she handed him a fresh set of clothes and a place to sleep. "I thought I was just gonna die out there," he said. "Didn't think anyone remembered us." Loretta sat beside him. "I did. And you're not gonna disappear, not on my watch." Word spread quickly. The center wasn't just another clinic. It was sacred ground. It had weight. It had the voice of a woman who'd been through hell and had come back with enough fire in her bones to light the way for others. On the first Friday of each month, the center held what they called roll call, an evening gathering for local veterans' families and anyone who needed to feel seen. There were folding chairs, free, hot meals, coffee music, and story circles. Sometimes the mayor came, sometimes a general. But every time Loretta opened the evening, she didn't always talk about the war. Often she spoke about survival, about silence, about how it feels to wake up and not know if you matter anymore. One Friday, she stood in front of the crowd wearing her silver star like it was just part of her skin. "I want you all to understand something," she said. "This medal, this building, this suit, they don't make me whole. What makes me whole is that I get to look you in the eyes and say, I see you. I hear you, and I won't forget you." She smiled gently as a young black woman in fatigues stood and saluted her from the third row. After the event, the woman approached her. "Ma'am, I'm shipping out next month," she said. "First deployment. I didn't think I had anything to fight for. But then I read your story." Loretta looked her over, sharp but kind. "You take care of your people out there. That's your job. Doesn't matter what they say about you when you come home. What matters is you come back standing." The woman nodded, fighting tears. "Yes, ma'am." Life still had its aches. Loretta's knee still gave her trouble. Her back flared up on rainy days. The trauma, the nightmares, they didn't vanish, but they lost their grip. For the first time in over 2 decades, she had a primary doctor. She had a community. She had peace, even when the ghosts whispered. One night, as she sat alone on the center's rooftop garden, she spoke to the sky. "I carried them, Lord," she said quietly. "All of them, even when I didn't think I could. I just hope that counts for something." The stars above didn't answer, but the breeze softened. Below her in the center's courtyard, young veterans laughed and passed food trays to one another. Somewhere a speaker played Marvin Gaye, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel alone. Back in Judge Denton's office, a letter sat framed on his desk. It was handwritten in Loretta's careful cursive. It read, "I don't hold hate in my heart, Maurice. I held you once when you were broken. I didn't do it because you deserved it. I did it because we were human. You forgot me, but now you remember. That's enough. Loretta James." He read it often, not for comfort, but for accountability. He gave lectures now occasionally at law schools on bias, judgment, humility. He never told the full story. He just reminded them every case has a name. And behind that name, there's a war you don't see. At her core, Loretta James was still the same woman who braced herself against windstorms in the desert, who wrapped wounds in torn cloth, who carried hope in silence. But now the world had a place for her story. Children at local schools wrote reports about her during Black History Month. VA hospitals requested her to speak at remembrance services. A documentary team began filming her life story slowly, respectfully on her terms. And when she walked into the grocery store, people stepped aside, not out of pity, but with recognition. "Thank you for your service," they said. And she always replied, "Thank you for remembering." The years moved forward quietly at first, like the slow ticking of a reliable clock. Loretta James didn't chase the spotlight. Fame had never been her mission. But her story, like a stone dropped into still water, kept rippling outward. The Loretta M. James Center for Forgotten Veterans expanded within 18 months. What started as a local initiative grew into a statewide model. Other cities began contacting Noah Alvarez and Loretta for guidance, how to build their own centers, how to staff them with people who knew what it meant to serve and be discarded. Politicians toured the building, took notes, shook hands, and some of them actually followed through. Noah stayed on. He never sought a title beyond what he already had. Loretta would sometimes call him her eyes and legs when her body ached too much to stand long hours. He responded with quiet loyalty. More than a colleague, he became family. They often sat late at night after long days, eating leftovers or sipping tea, discussing which case to prioritize next. But the ripple didn't stop at buildings and programs. Veterans who had once curled into themselves, silent, ashamed, hidden, began stepping out into the light again. They shared their stories, many for the first time. In community halls, barbershops, and kitchens, they spoke Loretta's name not as a myth, but as proof that endurance wasn't failure. A man named Ronnie Hanks, who had lived in a van for 12 years, showed up at the center one day with a stack of poems he'd written. He handed them to Loretta, hands shaking. "I stopped talking after my third tour," he said, "but your voice made me find mine again." She read his poems raw, cracked, beautiful, and arranged for a local publisher to compile them into a book. He cried when the first copy arrived, his name printed in the bold black letters on the cover. In small towns across the state, murals of Loretta began to appear, not commissioned by politicians or officials, painted by teenagers, veterans, artists who had heard the story and needed to honor it. One wall in Baton Rouge bore her image kneeling beside a wounded soldier, her eyes focused forward, her hand on his heart. Below it in bold red paint I stood, "Remember me." Every Veterans Day, the local news visited the center not for sound bites, but to listen. They brought coffee, donuts, real questions. Loretta never let them forget the others. The names not yet cleared, the heroes still invisible. She kept a bulletin board by her desk with photos of veterans still lost to the system. Above it hung a sign, "Until they're all seen." As for Judge Maurice Denton, he kept his promise. After stepping down, he took a teaching role at a state university and dedicated his work to judicial ethics and veteran justice. In his first class, he handed out a copy of Loretta's citation and made his students write essays not on law but on conscience. He never asked Loretta for forgiveness again. He didn't have to. She had given him something more powerful, the burden of remembering and the responsibility to act. Once during a panel discussion, someone asked him, "How did it feel realizing you convicted your own savior?" He looked into the crowd. "Like waking up in the middle of a fire," he said. "Only this time, someone else had the hose." Back at the center, Loretta kept her routines. She watered the rooftop garden every morning, checked in with the night shift before clocking out. She still moved slow on cold days, her knee reminding her of sandstorms and shrapnel. But she never complained. Her scars had become markers of survival, not shame. And then one day, she received an envelope thick official. Inside was a letter from the Department of Defense. She had been selected as the keynote speaker at the National Women Veterans Summit. She stared at the page for a long time, her thumb gently pressing the signature at the bottom. For a long time, no one had asked her to speak, then too many had, but this was different. This was the highest podium they could offer her. A stage built on silence now handed over to her voice. When the day came, she stood before an auditorium of women, pilots, medics, intelligence officers, engineers, Black, white, Latina, Native Asian, some in uniform, others in civilian clothes, but all with one thing in common, the burden of being forgotten too easily. She told them the truth. "I wore this country's name across my chest. I shed blood on its behalf. And when I came home, I was invisible. For decades, I lived as a ghost. And that didn't break me. You know what did?" She paused. "The laughter. The kind that comes when people look at your coat, your shoes, your walk, and see weakness. They didn't know that coat had soaked up the blood of men they send flowers to on holidays. They didn't know my limp came from a moment of running toward fire when everyone else ran away." She let the silence sit. "But I stand here today because someone finally listened, and if you take nothing else from my story, take this. Don't let silence be the last thing your service gives you. You've earned your voice. Use it, loudly, without apology." When she left the stage, the applause followed her like a tide. Later, in the quiet of her hotel room, she sat down and began to write a letter, not to any government, not to a paper, to herself. She wrote about that day in 1991, about the heat, the screams, the man she pulled from rubble whose name she'd almost forgotten until the courtroom moment. She wrote about the silence that followed and the weight she carried because no one else would. She ended it with a sentence that would later be etched into the front entrance of the James Center. "I served with my hands. I survived with my will, and I rose when the world forgot to kneel." She folded the letter and placed it in her desk drawer. Not for anyone else, just for her. The story of Loretta James is not just about war or medals, it's about what happens when the uniforms come off, when the parades end, and when the silence sets in. It's about the thousands, like her Black women veterans, caregivers, fighters who are erased, not because they were weak, but because the world refused to see their strength. Loretta never asked to be remembered, she asked only to matter. And in her quiet, steady way, she changed everything. Her name now lives not only on a wall, not only in a center, not only in dusty folders of the Department of Defense, it lives in the minds of those she touched, in the veterans who finally stepped out of the shadows, in the students who saw a Black woman kneel in front of a man who once judged her and rise without bitterness, in the judges who now think twice before sentencing those whose stories they haven't learned. This is a reminder for all of us. When you see someone walking slowly in worn-out boots, when you see gray hair under a military cap in a bus stop shelter, when you see someone standing in the corner of a mall not asking for anything but not leaving either, ask yourself, who are they really? What did they give up so you could go about your day untouched? And what will you do right now to remember them? Because heroes don't always come home to confetti. Some come back to locked doors, to broken systems, to silence. But they are no less heroic. Loretta James reminds us of this truth. Dignity is not something you earn through recognition. It's something you never lose, even when the world tries to take it from you. So don't wait until it's too late to lift someone up. Don't wait until a courtroom reminds you of a battlefield. Don't wait until someone breaks under the weight of being forgotten. See them, name them, stand beside them. And if you took something from this story, if it made you think, made you feel, made you pause, then I'm asking you to do something about it. Like this story, share it, leave a comment, tag someone who needs to hear it, and follow the Black Women channel where stories like Loretta's live breathe and continue. Because silence may forget, but we won't. Not now, not again.